Welcome to the Connected Teamwork podcast by Growth Leaders Network. How do we learn to truly thrive together? How do we stay connected to our authentic selves, each other, and our purpose as a team, especially when challenged? How do we unlock the deeper levels of group intelligence? Enjoy this episode of the Connected Teamwork podcast and learn practical tools to evolve the connectedness of your team to its next level.
Welcome to episode number 20 of the Connected Teamwork podcast. My name is Hylke Faber. I'm here with my co-host Carson, Heady, and guest Vignesh Shetty, Senior Vice President at GE Healthcare, and many other things as we will discover. The purpose of the Connected Teamwork podcast is to help remind each of us to find our way back to what's truly important to us and help each other do the same in the context of a team. And we all know how easy it is to get distracted. So if you're listening, welcome. And Vignesh, thank you for being here. How are you today?
Thank you for having me, Hylke and Carson. I'm doing amazingly well and looking forward to this.
Excellent. Me too. I really enjoyed our preparation. So let's dive right in. Tell us about what you have learned about connectedness in your life, in particular in terms of connectedness in a team or group setting.
Sure. On the topic of connectedness, I would say forging powerful connections, like we were just chatting, has been an extremely important part of my leadership journey. Early on in my career, I thought efforts like team outings and happy hours provided the appropriate social lubrication that was necessary. But over time, mercifully, I've learned that connectedness gets much deeper. And one of the ways I would love to talk about that is by sharing some of my stories. Because I truly believe that they are powerful tools to connect with each other because they can reveal our emotions, our motivations, our passions, and our purpose. And they also help me understand others better. Right. So one example, for instance, where we built connectedness as a team, and I learned quite a bit in the process, was a pivotal moment during a very tough product deadline where my team was feeling isolated, was feeling burnt out. There were a lot of silos in teams. So what we had to do was I invited everybody to an offsite. We reflected on what inspired us about the work, and each person, one by one, shared a little story. And so I'll just take names as in the interest of protecting confidentiality, I will use pseudonyms. But Ravi opened about losing his grandmother to inadequate rural healthcare in India. So we are a healthcare company. And he choked up during that offsite, but describing how her suffering drives him every single day to come back and bring his best self to work. And Emily, on the other hand, revealed about a special needs son who can now participate in an MRI-based study thanks to the technology she helped design, which now reduces the time patients spend inside an MRI machine by 50%, allows special needs children, senior citizens who are claustrophobic, to not have to be suffering a suboptimal patient experience. So that was her driver. And when people were done, there was not a dry eye in the room. And in that moment is kind of where we saw each other as whole human beings with a power, not just co-workers. And ever since, we've remained a tightly bonded team through difficult product launches and late nights.
Vignesh, that's an incredible story. And I think it speaks to one of the themes that we have on this show in Connected Teamwork is it all starts with the person and with the mission. And, just an observation of your career, you've spent a lot of time in technology and also in healthcare, two industries that have changed dramatically over the time you've served them. I often find that though when we take on a new team or when we're working to recalibrate, spending time with the person and realigning to the mission is of critical importance. How have you stayed at the pulse of your team through the rapid changes that have transpired through healthcare and through technology over the last few decades?
Oh, that's a great question. I think again, anything I say may make it sound more deliberate than it actually was. A lot of it was me attempting to try out a few things, seeing what works, and then refining the process by which I connect and bond with team. Let me again give you an example of things that I didn't do right. But early on, as a new manager, I had the tendency to tightly control my team's projects to avoid mistakes. While the output was pretty solid, engagement suffered. And to your point about rapidly changing industries, here's an example of how it was a suboptimal outcome for patients and providers because of my particular style. What I realized was one of our data scientists had proposed an algorithm that at that point nobody had asked for in conventional product management terms. Um, I had my doubts, but I let him run with that experiment. And what that experiment did was it demonstrated efficacy that was significantly different than what we would expect. And it spearheaded not just a hugely successful product line, but also fundamentally reshaped the patient experience in ways that I hadn't envisioned. So this is an example of how, you know, being able energizing your team to be able to create, not just execute, hit me. And it made me realize that my tight grip sort of stymied innovation. So the key learning for me was, especially in fast changing fields, whether that's networking at Cisco, healthcare, make sure teams feel accountable, not just compliant. And by autonomy, I mean fundamentally make sure you hire the right folks and give them the ability and the psychological safety to make some mistakes, cede some control, because the value of empowerment far outweighs the cost, right? And my proudest accomplishments in hindsight have only been possible by distributing trust and distributing ownership, especially in fast changing fields, because nobody is smart all the time.
So think about that, sort of that deep distribution of empowerment of people actually being able to do their work. In you, Vignesh, I sense a lot of purposefulness, like being very clear about the why, not getting distracted with the short-term gain, which might have been control or micromanagement, but actually is being able to take a step back and say, what is actually most of service here, right? And then I look at your career, and you're now in healthcare. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey with purposefulness? Because I sense there's something there.
Sure. So there is, like I was touching upon earlier, no easy way to arrive at that answer, and because there's no quick fix, right? But the way I try to approach it is reminding myself on my shared why, our shared why, when it comes to the team, and helping each person try and unlock their unique value, because that's the only way to create bonds that can weather any storm. So to give you specific tricks that I try and use to try and center myself, because I think I love the way you describe it, okay, in the beginning, is how do you center yourself, right? So the first thing I ask is I ask myself, imagine your 80th birthday celebration. Who's there? What do they talk about when they come to that event or that celebration? Also write down your personal and professional legacy, and then work backwards to live it, right? Because, and more importantly, when I say work backwards to live it, try and ensure that your calendar at least approximately reflects what you want people to talk about you, both professionally and personally, on your 80th birthday or even beyond. So in the second thing I try and do is, when I try and remind myself of the shared why, define in very simple terms that I can describe to my fifth grader what my reason for existence is, what our team's reason for existence is, what the organization's reason for existence is, right? Because that's when you create a strong sense of meaning, motivation for myself, for my team. That's another thing that I try and do. A third one is try and take time to unplug completely. And this is, hiking in the wilderness, away from all technology, all distraction, because out there, nature, surrounded by awe-inspiring vistas, right? My usual worries will vanish. And that's, as an example, one of these hiking trails is when I started to draw an analogy. And I also met interesting people. I met farmers. And then I started to draw connections between how we approach life in healthcare and in technology with how they approach farming. If you think about it, right, our role as a leader isn't very different than a farmer. Because if you're a farmer, you don't shout at the crops. You don't blame the crops for not growing fast enough. You don't uproot the crops before they've had a chance to grow. That's what you get to hear when you talk to them, right? You choose the best plants for the soil, of course. You irrigate it, you fertilize it, you remove the weeds periodically. And then you also remember that you'll have good seasons and bad seasons because you can't control the weather, but you can be prepared for it. So if you step back, those sort of conversations make you realize that the surface area for luck and for performance will only increase if you're well positioned and you can adapt to changes in the environment. And so those are some of the things that I do, including paying myself first, creating sacred morning time, about 5 minutes in the morning to begin your day, and then spending time with customers and understanding the true problems.
Thank you.
Vignesh, I wish we had met about 10 years ago because I could have used a lot of that that guidance earlier in my career. But I have learned some of those things, and I'm very interested in how you help your team establish what I like to call the infrastructure needed to be successful in those endeavors. And what I mean by that is, I think you did a really good job of articulating how do you get at the pulse of your team? How do you understand what they are great at? You know, what is their unique superpower? How can we empower and enable them to be their best selves and feel like they're in a space where they can bring you ideas that you can explore and that you can discuss and everybody can do what they're great at? But what you've laid out is so important. How do you help someone build their strategy, their personal strategy, you know, whether it's their career trajectory or how they show up? How do you help them build that around their mission?
It's a great question. I would say I think it starts by trying to understand what is it that they would like to get out of this interaction with you. So, for instance, in general, I think the guidelines, and none of what I'm about to say, I think, is unique, but it truly has worked for me, is lead with empathy, right? And empathy is what helps us communicate clearly and consistently, which means we listen more before we speak. I think a mentor of mine very early on in my career drilled this head by saying, Vignesh, you've got 2 ears and one mouth for a reason. You've got to listen twice as much as you speak. And that sort of stuck with me. So I first try and ask them, how can I be of service? As opposed to, and how can I set you up for success? I don't specifically use the words, how can I help? Because when I use the words, how can I help? I sometimes, and this is feedback I got from one of my mentees, take power away from the individual by saying, you need my help, as opposed to, you've got what it takes to be successful. How can I help set you up or accelerate you on your journey you're already well along, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, and this kind of goes back to, I think, the question you didn't ask, which is, how do you build important connectors in teams?
Right.
So if you want to build a strong team, I think one of the things I've realized is work with individuals and identify shared values, shared beliefs, and shared experiences. And we can touch upon more if you want. I want to make sure I give you back questions to dig in if you've got any further clarifying questions.
It's brilliant. I'm still with the farming metaphor, Vignesh. So I'm thinking there's the farmer, there's Vignesh, the farmer leader, right? And as you were on your hikes and as you were in your contemplations, what is one thing that you are in the process of unlearning today, given the farmer awareness that you're having? What's one thing you're learning to unlearn? Because I find that's often where the hardest learning happens, is unlearning. Like, what is something you're unlearning?
I think the one of the things that I'm unlearning, and I think we touched upon it when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, is how to try and put yourself in the shoes of the other person that you're trying to help with the best of intentions before you offer advice. Because I'm an engineer by training, and by definition, my natural instinct is to problem solve before I understand what they're actually expecting of me. They may not always be looking for a solution, right? And I think this was, as a concrete example, I think I touched upon this, okay, when we spoke. And when I just became a people leader, it was what they call a battlefield promotion. Within 6 months, I had just joined the industry, and within 6 months, all other 8 members of the team quit for a variety of reasons and moved to other groups in my first company. Then I was out there being the senior most person leading the operating system group for the entire company. And all of while I'm still trying to define my place in the industry, trying to figure out if I'm ready for the industry. I have just out of college. And then very shortly thereafter, I became a people leader. And because I'd taken on this job at a non-linearly early stage of my career, I was thrust into being the person who knew the most in that space. And when I became a people leader, I transitioned from being an individual contributor to a people leader. Guess what? I had a hard time letting go. With the best of intentions, when my team tried to answer questions or tried to solve problems, I jumped in and said, hey, that's not how you do it. Here's how you could do it better, faster, and cheaper. And guess what? Maybe in a lot of cases, I did help the solution because I did point out blind spots. At least I would like to believe I did. But I lost buy-in. And it wasn't until one of them came back and had the courage to come and tell me, hey, Vignesh, if you're the leader, I'm the technology lead. If you're basically going to tell me how to do my job, then are you sure you really need me? Because you seem to be doing just fine yourself. That's when it struck me that I need to be able to listen more, understand what they're looking for, and it's not always solutions to problems. Sometimes they just want a ear to someone to talk to, a sounding board. That's something I think struggle with on a regular basis, and I have to be in the moment, be present, and step back to ensure that I don't get into my default pattern of problem solving.
I think that's exceptionally common, right? I read a lot around making that transition to leader, and I talk with a lot of leaders, some that are early stage, some that were individual contributors in the role and then ascended to the title, and then others who come from external. And I think they struggle with different challenges in that they may not have the immediate credibility of having done the role previously. But what would you tell someone who is in that transition from an individual contributor to the role of leader? If you could tell somebody who's newly promoted, I find that making that transition, you almost, to your point, you have to have that mindset shift where you're not the hero, you're the hero maker, and you want to meet them where they are, uncover what they're uniquely strong at, and ultimately do whatever you can to empower and enable them to bring their best selves. From your experience, Vignesh, what would you share with a new manager?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would suggest to the new manager would be, how would you define success, and closely watch and listen to their choice of words, depending on whether it's a verbal conversation or whether they want to document it. And then it's particularly important because, again, speaking from personal experience, that I coach them into arriving at the conclusion as opposed to telling them what they aren't doing well or what pitfalls to avoid. Because my experience has been, the minute you get too prescriptive in identifying what pitfalls to avoid, they tend to listen, but the retention is lower than me asking a set of clarifying questions or probing questions and ideally coaching them to arrive at the answer themselves. So in terms of approach, I would ask them questions, but not try and desist from giving answers. Specific examples of questions would be, what does success look like for your team and for you? How different are they from a team basis to an individual basis? And the intent of that question would be to try and tease out if they see those as orthogonal, because this, as an individual contributor, especially early career, a large part of how you determine your own success and how typically your reporting manager determines your success is your direct contribution. Right? How smart are you? How many lines of code you've written, or how many patients have you served, depending on your choice of fields. Right. But if you sort of take that forward, and to your point, you're trying to be the smartest person in the room, even as the people leader, you've lost the opportunity to be able to act as a force multiplier for your team. Mm-hmm. And being able to help them arrive at that conclusion that their role as an individual isn't at odds with their role as a team leader is a big part of the conversation, in my view. Right. The second is, of course, getting them to think about what would they stop doing more deliberately than I suspect most of them would have. Because the minute you start to table what are the things you would stop doing as you become a new people leader, you're sort of framing your brain to think very differently than you've been used to in the past. Because the very act of having to capture that hopefully makes you think, makes you retrospect to reflect, and then it allows for a more stimulating and an engaging follow-on conversation with that individual.
I so resonate with what you're saying, Vignesh. When you were describing this transition from being the smartest person in the room, which makes you stay with us, that little program may stay with us the rest of our lives because it's kind of a comforting thing if you were that for a while. The transitioning from, you could say, IQ to more EQ, and I would call that CQ based, connectedness quotient, like something that's about how we connect with each other, which goes right into what are the things I need to stop doing to develop my connectedness capacity. How do I do this? And this is not an intelligence many of us get taught from early on, and maybe implicitly if we're lucky by our caregivers. We're going to take a short break, and then after the break, we're going to talk more about how do we work this, especially with teams that are very disconnected. How do we do that? We're talking with Vignesh Shetty, a senior vice president from GE Healthcare, a conversation about how do we build truly connected teamwork by finding a way to develop and catalyze success in the other. We'll be right back. We'll be right back after the break.
You are listening to the Connected Teamwork podcast by Growth Leaders Network. Do you want to learn more about building the next level of connectedness in your team? Please contact Growth Leaders Network on LinkedIn. And now, back to the show.
So we've been talking about farmers, teams, writing code, being the smartest person in the room, all on the surface of thinking about how do we actually find the wherewithal to build truly connected teams. So Vignesh, think about a team or situation where people are truly disconnected, or maybe a situation where you've been where you felt that sense of disconnection. Where do you start? Where do you recommend people start to find their way back or forward?
Yeah. And so let me start by saying, give you some of the areas where, in my experience, people have really identified disconnection in the organization, and then how that's dramatically impacted both their sense of well-being at an individual level, as well as the performance of the group, right? So, for example, one of the things that I've noticed that really hurts our team's performance and morale is when there's a disconnect between what the leader says and what they do. So, in other words, when your formal culture, which is the official values, the policies of your organization, doesn't match your informal culture, which is the behaviors and the norms of your people and coffee tables, corridors, etc. That's when you create confusion, you create mistrust. And despite what you would like, most organizations would follow the informal culture because that's what they see and experience every day, right? For example, I remember when I worked at my previous company, we had an executive who had always talked about innovation and encouraged us to produce bold new ideas. But whenever we did that as a team, he would shoot them down or ignore them. And so he was sending mixed signals to our teams, who then eventually lost their motivation and engagement, right? I'll give another example of where this has occurred. Um, when you withhold or hide information that affects somebody else's work, you also create both disconnectors and you create both and frustration and resentment. So, for example, again, pseudonyms. When we had a colleague named Joe who oversaw product development, he never shared the product timeline or the status with marketing, even though it kept changing. And this left our marketing department in a very difficult position because, especially when you had to go for large trade shows and events where you had to make external launches and plan for branding and messaging, they were walking in without knowing when the product would be ready or what capabilities it would have. Right? So these are examples of where, and then the third, of course, is when you treat people as objects rather than human beings, you, in some ways, I would say, devalue their humanity and their contributions or their potential. This is another example where, when I was again talking to a client executive, and he introduces me to someone as one of our saleswomen instead of using her name. And then the rest of the meeting, he never acknowledged her presence, even though she was there and arguably the most knowledgeable person in the topic we were discussing at that point. And anything that, in my mind, anything he made her feel like she was just a, a number, not a person with a name, a story, and something to contribute. And that is dehumanizing. So if you do any of those things on a recurring basis, I suspect you're going to end up with a subpar outcome as well as a highly demotivated organization. Right? And the simple answer to solve for that is to lead with empathy, is the ability to understand, share the feelings of others, to communicate clearly and consistently, and follow it up with actions that mirror your words. And then being able to share information openly and transparently.
Lack of clarity, lack of communication, and lack of consistency are toxic for connectedness. And Vignesh, I would be remiss not to ask as well, because you've led teams that are, global, diverse teams that have undergone pretty dramatic shift in how we work together. Specifically over the last few years, obviously, we've become much more hybrid in the way we work. There is an expectation, sometimes a demand, from our teams to have that remote ability to work. And I think there's some benefits to having an empowered remote workforce. But how have you adjusted in order to ensure that you still have connectedness in your teams? What has been fundamental to having the foundation of an effective, connected, diverse remote team?
No, I think, sorry, you touched upon a very important point, and you touched upon both diversity and the changing norms of the workplace. Yeah. So the first thing I want to touch upon is, so I'm part of G Healthcare, and our mission is to be changing the world in a way where healthcare has no limits. And our conscious attempt, if you want to change the world as we should, is to be able to reflect the world. So in terms of our hiring practices, and this is even more true today than it was 3 years ago, I think we're making a conscious effort to try and reflect the diversity, not just gender, but cognitive diversity, the diversity in perspective, in how we bring people to work. Because we've seen that have a dramatic effect in the richness of the conversations, in our ability to identify and mitigate, if not eliminate, blind spots. And most importantly, it's I think something that reflects in what our customers are telling us and how we build our product, because it does sort of translate to products that are more representative of the broader population that we serve. When we're not, while we are headquartered in the US, we serve the world. And I think what we are hearing is our products are now starting to be more sensitive to the unique needs of people outside of the United States, which is, I think, a great thing. The other reason that I suspect this is happening is because as I think, as an industry, while we got a ways to go, gotten slightly better, not perfect, but better at being able to incorporate and assimilate different ways of working and ensure that we can value and tap into their insights and their contributions. So even if somebody's fully remote, regardless of where they are, if they bring a unique set of perspectives and contributions to the mix, we've found a way to be able to create both space within the organization, and more importantly, we've been able to create mechanisms that allow for increased psychological safety for remote teams. And I'll give you a specific example of what I mean, right? This is something we've been trying the last 6 months, which is try and move to a writing-based culture as opposed to a reading-based one. So in the past, we used to be largely meeting-oriented, and we still have a lot of meetings, but we don't use meetings to try and bring people to the same page. We use more asynchronous means of communication where you get people to write down what they want to say and what they want to get out of a meeting before the meeting. And then, because as we've realized that this allows people to internalize across time zones, across geographies, what the intent of the conversation is going to be and what the expected outcome is ahead of time. It also allows people to asynchronously via comments provide feedback and then allow for a richer conversation when we actually meet, either virtually or in person. So these are some of the examples of what we try to do to both be more, I would say, more conducive to remote workers and more inclusive in how we sort of bring people to a common fold, if you would.
I'm so struck, Vignesh, by the effortlessness with which you describe all of this. And I keep thinking about, you're talking about leading with empathy, really thinking about, okay, what does a person who is remote need and how do I address that? What does a person who is different from me in a different culture or a different part of society need? How do I work with that? How do I help the people in my team be successful? What do they need? I see that as a recurring theme from what you've been speaking. This conversation is almost at an end in the next minute or so. One final question for you, Vignesh. In one sentence or two, what would you like to say to a leader who in this moment is just not quite at that place of connectedness and is interested to get there? What would you say to them?
Well, I would say first, make sure you focus on the problem you're trying to solve, not the product you're trying to build, right? Because a job has a higher purpose that your customers hire your product or a service for. It's the why behind their decision. And make sure that you understand the why and then rally your team around it, because that is how you make a difference. And it's usually not the functional aspects, but also the emotional and social aspects that you need to bring to bear to be able to create that non-linear outcome. And then lastly, I would say, remember that the most powerful ideas don't rarely come from the top. True innovation flourishes through bottoms-up experimentation. Our job as leaders is resisting the urge to command. Instead, focus on inspiring teams to unlock their full potential.
Fantastic. Leading with empathy, letting the ideas and brilliance come from the people where they are, and don't fall into the trap of command and control and thinking that you know so well. Thank you so much for being with us, Vignesh. I hope if you listened that you found something that you found helpful. There were so many pieces here today, all the way from learning from the farmer to thinking about how do I truly stay empathetic? How do I stay very connected to the why? Not only define the problem from the space of IQ, but also from a sense of emotion and where the person might be. Take something you like and leave the rest. And we'll see you next time at the Connected Teamwork Podcast. Thank you for listening.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Connected Teamwork Podcast by Growth Leaders Network. Take a moment to reflect on what you learned today that can help build your team. Also, if you like, think about one of your team members and what you appreciate about them. Let them know. Enjoy connecting more deeply to what is great about them. And see you next time at the Connected Teamwork Podcast.